Welcome to True Crime Lullaby, where truth lies between darkness and dawn. Out here in the quiet woods, the fire hums and the air feels still, like the world is holding its breath. Tonight's story begins in a Texas suburb, under the soft buzz of porch lights and the hum of distant crickets. A story about love, routine, and what happens when a life built on control finally breaks. As always, my role isn't to judge, only to tell the story, softly, as it happened. So, get cozy by the fire. You're safe here. Settle in, and let's begin. Spring Branch, Texas, a quiet suburb northwest of Houston, where the air smells faintly of cut grass and gasoline, and porch lights glow amber through the long summer nights. On most evenings, you can hear sprinklers clicking in neat rows and the low hum of traffic on the interstate miles away. It's the kind of place that promises safety, predictability. In 1997, that's what Susan Wright thought she was walking into, safety. She was 20 when she met Jeff. She'd been working at a restaurant, waiting tables, saving what she could, and he'd come in one night with co-workers, loud and confident, the kind of man who filled the room with ease. He flirted shamelessly, left a big tip, and came back the next night, then the next. Susan wasn't used to attention. She was soft-spoken, polite, more likely to listen than talk. Jeff, with his blue eyes and his restless energy, seemed like a force of nature. He told her she was beautiful, smart, too good to be working there. He said he wanted to take care of her. It's a dangerous sentence, but when you're young and hungry for love, it sounds like a vow. They married within a year, moved into a small, single-story home with beige siding and a chain-link fence that buzzed faintly when the kids down the street hit it with sticks. Inside, it smelled of new paint and baby powder. They hung pictures in the hallway, wedding photos, baby photos, the kind of evidence that things were working out. And for a while, it really did seem perfect. Jeff worked installing carpets, often gone for long hours, but proud of the house he was paying for. Susan stayed home with the children, first Bradley, then Kaylee. She loved being a mother, loved the routines, nap times, afternoon walks, peanut butter sandwiches cut diagonally. They had barbecues with neighbors, laughed too loudly in grocery store aisles, and drove to Galveston on weekends to let the kids run barefoot in the sand. From the outside, they looked ordinary, even happy. But behind closed doors, the air in that little house was heavy. It started, as it always does, with small things. Jeff didn't like one of Susan's friends, said she was a bad influence, always trying to fill Susan's head with nonsense. So Susan stopped seeing her. He didn't like when she went to her mother's without telling him first, said it made him feel disrespected, so she called before every visit. Then it was the clothes, shorts that were too short, lipstick that was too bright. The rules came wrapped in concern. I just want to protect you. When she was late from the store, he accused her of talking to another man. When she cried, he said she was manipulative. He'd shout, slam doors, pace the hallway like a caged animal. And then he'd apologize, always with tears, always with promises. Susan believed him, not because she was naive, but because she wanted to. Because each apology carried the memory of the man she met at that restaurant. Funny, charming, so full of light. The cycle became their rhythm, calm, storm, calm again. Years slipped by. Neighbors saw less of her. The children grew quiet too, learning, in their own way, how to move around their father's moods. Jeff didn't want Susan working, so she didn't. He handled all the bills, all the bank accounts. When the phone rang, he wanted to know who it was. When she smiled too long at a waiter, he went cold. Sometimes, after he'd gone to bed, she'd stand in the hallway, just to listen, to make sure he was really asleep before she let herself breathe. Once, during a family visit, her sister noticed a bruise on her arm. Susan said she'd tripped on a toy, and her sister, not wanting to pry, not wanting to believe, nodded and changed the subject. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being disbelieved. It's like drowning in plain sight. By 2002, Jeff's temper had become unpredictable. He was drinking more, staying out later, calling her names in front of the kids. Once, he threw a phone across the room so hard it cracked the wall. Another time, he grabbed her by the throat during an argument about money, squeezing just long enough for her to see stars before he let go. The next morning, he brought flowers. That night, he kissed her forehead and said, "You know I'd never really hurt you." It's strange how easily love can twist itself around fear until they're indistinguishable. She thought about leaving, packed bags twice, but both times he found her before she got to the car. "You're not taking my kids," he said. "If you ever walk out that door, I'll kill you." And she believed him, so she stayed. In early 2003, something shifted. He'd been distant, colder, meaner. He accused her of cheating, of plotting against him. She found a hotel receipt in his jeans pocket, lipstick on his collar. When she confronted him, he laughed, told her she was crazy, told her she'd be nothing without him. That night, he shoved her so hard, she hit the dresser and fell. The kids saw. She pretended she was fine, smiling through tears, the way mothers do when they need to protect their children from the truth. Later, as she tucked them into bed, Kaylee asked, "Mommy, are you okay?" Susan said yes, but her hands were still shaking. The next day, she bought new sheets, cleaned the house, cooked dinner like always, but inside her chest, something had snapped. February 13th, 2003, the air was thick with humidity. The Wright house sat quiet, every lamp haloed with soft yellow light. Jeff came home late. He smelled like beer and sweat. Susan had been waiting. She told him she wanted to make things right, to surprise him before Valentine's Day. A romantic evening, candles, soft music, just the two of them. He laughed, thought it was cute, thought she was finally trying again. He didn't see the tremor in her hands when she poured his drink. He didn't hear the whisper of breath she took before tying the first knot. The bedroom was small, warm, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every sound feel exaggerated. The scrape of a chair, the creak of the floor, the small catch in a woman's throat. Jeff lay back, smiling. Susan tied one wrist to the bedpost, then the other. He made a joke she didn't laugh at, then she tied his ankles. The air smelled of candle wax and sweat. When she stepped away, his smile faltered. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't answer. Her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere far away, to every night she'd slept with one eye open, every apology she'd swallowed, every bruise she'd hidden. She went to the dresser, pulled out a knife she'd used earlier to slice vegetables for dinner. When she turned back, he was watching her, confused. He started to speak, and that's when she moved. He didn't see her coming. There's a moment, small, microscopic, between disbelief and pain, when the world still holds its breath. The knife came down once, glancing off his shoulder. He shouted, startled more than hurt. The second blow found its mark. Then another, and another. He thrashed, tried to lift his arms, but the ties held. His voice filled the room. Anger, confusion, fear, all braided together. He called her name. She didn't answer. To Susan, the sound of his voice was far away, like someone yelling through a wall underwater. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears. Everything else dissolved into motion, bright, red, mechanical. The blade rose and fell, each strike a pulse of years pressed into muscle memory. The sound of glass breaking, the sting of being called useless, the weight of hands around her throat. The candles flickered, the air filled with the scent of wax and iron. Then finally, silence. When it was over, she was shaking. The room looked unreal, sheets tangled, the wall spattered, the carpet soaked through. Jeff's chest had gone still. His eyes were open, unfocused, as if watching something just beyond the ceiling. For a long time she stood there, staring. The knife fell from her hand. It made a dull, wet sound against the carpet. She sat on the edge of the bed, her breathing shallow. There was a ringing in her ears. Somewhere, faintly, a child stirred in the next room. Her daughter. Susan froze. The thought of the children snapped through her trance like lightning. She went down the hallway, her bare feet leaving faint prints, opened their door. Both of them were asleep, faces soft, mouths open, lost in dreams. She wanted to wake them, to take them and run, but she didn't know where to go. She tucked the blanket around them instead, whispered, "It's okay." Then she sat in the hallway until dawn. At sunrise, the house felt colder. The blood had darkened to rust. Susan walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and washed her hands. The water ran pink, then clear. She didn't call 911. She called her mother. When her mother answered, half asleep, Susan's voice was quiet, almost steady. "Mama," she said, "I think I killed Jeff." There was a pause. Then her mother said, "Call the police." Susan hung up, but she didn't dial. When the knock came half an hour later, her mother frantic, Susan opened the door, calm, pale, barefoot. Inside, the house smelled like copper and wax. The scene was too quiet for what it contained. Her mother gasped, screamed. Susan just stood there. When the police arrived, the first officer gagged before stepping inside. The air was thick and metallic. The bedroom looked like something out of a nightmare. Walls streaked red, the sheets clinging to the bed frame like wet paper. Jeff was still bound, his wrists bruised deep from the ties. One officer later said he'd never seen anything so violent in 20 years. In the living room, Susan sat cross-legged on the couch, her face pale but dry. She wasn't crying. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. "Ma'am," the detective said, "can you tell me what happened?" She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "He was going to kill me." Nothing else. Crime scene technicians moved through the house in silence. They took photos, each one a slice of horror under fluorescent light. In the bathroom, they found towels soaked through. In the sink, streaks of red diluted by water. In the children's room, tiny footprints tracked across the carpet, small, bare, leading halfway down the hall before turning back. That detail stayed with every detective who saw it, the idea of two children wandering out of sleep into that kind of nightmare. The knife was on the floor beside the bed. The medical examiner would later count 193 stab wounds, too many to make sense of, some deep, some shallow, some clustered together like the frantic rhythm of panic. No one could decide what it meant. Rage, terror, insanity, all of it. At the station they gave her water, offered her a blanket. She didn't ask for a lawyer. Her statement was short, halting. She said he'd been violent for years, that he'd raped her days before, that he'd told her she'd never leave him alive. That night, she said, he came home angry, that she'd wanted to calm him down, to keep him from hurting her again. She told them she'd tied him up so he couldn't hit her. But once he was bound, she said, something inside her snapped. "I just kept seeing his face," she said quietly. "Every time he hurt me, every time he said I was nothing." She said she didn't remember counting the stabs. She didn't remember stopping. Child Protective Services interviewed the kids the next day. Bradley, 6, said he'd heard Mommy and Daddy yelling. Kaylee, 4, said she thought her mommy was crying. Neither remembered the blood. Maybe they never really saw it. Maybe their minds blurred it away to survive. In time, they'd grow up holding two versions of the same truth, that their father was dead and that their mother was the one who made it happen. Within 24 hours, the story exploded across Texas. Blue-eyed butcher, Valentine's Day killer, housewife slays husband 193 times. The press loved it. A pretty woman, a suburban home, a weapon of passion. But the headlines missed what was underneath, the years of silence, the exhaustion of survival. Reporters painted her as a femme fatale, a manipulator. They showed her wedding photo on every news broadcast, her eyes bright, her smile sweet, beside a man no one yet knew would die in that same house. People argued in grocery store lines and diners. She's evil. She's broken. She's crazy. The medical report told its own story. 75 wounds to the face and neck, 40 to the chest, the rest scattered, arms, legs, back, abdomen. Many of the wounds were shallow, tentative. Others were deep enough to reach bone. He'd been alive for most of it. There were defensive wounds, but not many, his hands tied too tight to fight back. To some, the brutality proved premeditation. To others, it showed hysteria, the collapse of years' worth of terror into one violent eruption. The examiner wrote in his notes, "Uncontrolled." It was as clinical as it was tragic. In the county jail, Susan was quiet. She kept to herself, spent hours staring out the small slit of window. Guards said she was polite, never caused trouble. Other inmates called her the nice lady. She didn't talk much about what happened. When she did, it was always the same. He was going to kill me. I just got there first. But some nights, they said, she'd wake up screaming, hands clutching her throat, and when the guards checked on her, she'd whisper, "I thought he was still here." A local news station requested an interview. She agreed. Sitting under harsh lights, wearing a jail jumpsuit, she looked more like a frightened child than a murderer. The reporter asked, "Do you regret what you did?" Susan hesitated. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. "I regret that I had to do it," she said. "I wish somebody had believed me sooner." When the interview aired, the public split even more sharply. Half saw a manipulative actress, half saw a woman destroyed long before she picked up the knife. In the district attorney's office, a stack of photos and evidence files sat on a metal desk under humming fluorescent light. They studied the photos like maps, trying to trace motive in the mess of it. One prosecutor said, "You don't stab someone 193 times because you're scared." Another replied, "You might if you've been scared for 10 years. But in court, nuance doesn't always win. What matters is story, and the state's story was simple. She wanted out, she planned it, and she executed him. Her public defenders were young, underfunded, but determined. They built their case around battered woman syndrome, calling experts to explain how chronic abuse reshapes the brain, how fight, flight, or freeze becomes obey, endure, survive. They showed photos of bruises, medical records, old police reports that were never filed because she'd been too afraid. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in her own home. When they rested their case, the courtroom was silent. Even the reporters stopped taking notes. Meanwhile, the house on Cedar Knolls Drive sat empty. The neighbors avoided walking their dogs past it. Sometimes, late at night, people said they could see the bedroom light flicker on, then off. The realtor eventually replaced the carpet, repainted the walls, sold it cheap. But there are some places that never really clean themselves. That room, with its new coat of white paint, still hummed with memory. The faint outline of something that once was love, pressed forever into the walls. The courtroom felt colder than February ever could. Fluorescent lights hummed above the jurors' heads. Reporters filled the benches, their pens whispering across notepads like insects. Every seat was taken, strangers leaning forward, hungry for a story they could fold neatly into good and evil. Susan sat at the defense table in a plain blue blouse. Her hair, once blonde, was darker now, pulled back with a rubber band. Her hands rested on the table, palms flat, fingertips pressed together. When she entered, a ripple went through the crowd, that same uneasy curiosity that follows tragedy when it wears a human face. To one side, Jeff's family sat stiff and silent. His mother's hands were clasped around a handkerchief, white knuckles trembling. And at the other table, the state of Texas waited to make its case. They began with the photographs. Projected onto a screen larger than life, they became something almost abstract. Not blood, but color. Not death, but shape. "This," the prosecutor said, pointing to the image, "is what rage looks like." He turned toward the jury, his voice even. She didn't defend herself. She executed him. She wanted freedom, and she took it. He talked about the number, 193. He said it like a spell, as if repeating it enough times might explain the unimaginable. He spoke of motive, of money, of manipulation. He described Susan as a woman who knew what she was doing, who planned every step, who smiled while she tied the knots. When he finished, he let silence fill the room. The jurors didn't move. Susan didn't either. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes, stood slowly. He'd spent weeks trying to thread a needle through two opposing truths, that she did kill him and that she had once loved him. He began not with evidence, but with a question. "Have you ever been afraid?" he asked the jury. "Not once, but always. So afraid that even when it's quiet, you still listen for footsteps?" He told them about the bruises, the police calls that never became reports, the neighbors who'd heard shouting but said nothing. He told them how abuse doesn't start with fists. It starts with words and ends with erasure. He said, "You can call it self-defense. You can call it breaking, but please don't call it evil." He spoke about battered woman syndrome, about the brain's long surrender to survival. He said she'd been living in a cage with invisible bars, and that the night she killed him wasn't a plan. It was a collapse. When he sat down, the air in the room shifted. Even the light seemed softer. Her mother took the stand. She told stories of phone calls late at night, Susan whispering from the bathroom, saying she couldn't take it anymore. Once, her mother had begged her to leave, and Susan, voice shaking, had said, "He'll find me." There were friends, too. One who'd seen her flinch when Jeff reached for her, another who'd noticed how she'd stopped laughing. The jurors wrote notes, some wiped their eyes. Then the prosecution brought out Jeff's co-worker, a man who swore Jeff had loved his wife. "He wasn't perfect," he said, "but he didn't deserve this." And everyone agreed. No one deserves what happened. But still, the question hung there. What do you deserve after surviving something that never ends? When the lawyers rested, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed. The courthouse emptied of reporters, of curious spectators, of families holding their grief like briefcases. Susan sat alone in the hallway, staring at the floor. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. She didn't expect freedom. She only wanted the truth to be seen. When the jury returned, the room was so still you could hear the bailiff's shoes on the tile. The foreman stood, paper shaking slightly in his hand. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," he read, "we find the defendant not guilty." A murmur swept through the gallery. Then, "On the charge of murder in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty." Susan exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a sob. The judge's voice was flat, procedural. 20 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Jeff's mother cried out. Reporters ran for the phones. Susan bowed her head and whispered, "Okay." When the bailiff cuffed her wrists, she didn't resist. She looked over her shoulder once, not at anyone, but toward the door, as if the sunlight outside still belonged to her for a few more seconds. At the women's facility near Gatesville, days fell into rhythm. Breakfast, work duty, quiet hours. Susan kept mostly to herself. She read books on trauma and faith. She attended therapy groups. She wrote letters to her children that began the same way every time. "My darlings, I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for what I allowed before that. I hope you will understand someday that I loved you even when I was breaking." She never used the word murder. She called it the night. Other inmates said she was kind. Some said she never raised her voice. A few said they heard her crying in her sleep, not loud, but steady, like rain against a window. Every year, she marked their birthdays by drawing small hearts in the margins of her Bible. And when she saw her reflection in the metal mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman who'd once smiled through fear was gone. What remained was quieter, steadier, almost hollow. Time moved differently beyond the fence. Her children grew up. The house on Cedar Knolls Drive changed owners. Neighbors stopped whispering. The story became one more local legend, told in fragments, distorted by distance. Some said she'd gone mad. Some said she'd been justified. Most simply stopped caring. But there are stories that don't fade. They just sink into the soil. In December 2020, Susan Wright walked free. 16 years gone. The sky over Gatesville was the color of ash. She carried one small box, a Bible, a family photo, a letter from her son. Outside the gate, there was no one waiting, no reporters, no family, just air. She took a breath and looked around. Everything felt too big, too loud. The sky, the trees, the silence. She got into a car arranged by a halfway house program and stared out the window as the miles passed. The world had moved on without her. Billboards now flashed LED lights. Phones had no cords. Music came from invisible speakers. She watched it all, as if from underwater, her reflection ghosting against the glass. Her new home was small, a one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex west of Houston. The carpet was thin. The air smelled faintly of detergent. At night, she kept the window open just enough to hear the crickets. Sometimes, she thought she heard something else too, a low hum, like a memory. The therapist she saw once a week told her it was normal, the body remembering, the echo of danger in the muscles, even when the mind wants peace. But some nights, it wasn't just echo, it was presence. She'd wake up certain someone was standing in the doorway, not Jeff exactly, more like the shape of what he'd been, a shadow of unfinished noise. She'd lie still, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, her heart keeping its own rhythm. 1, 2, 3, and the shadow would fade. After her release, she began writing again. Not to the public, not to her children, but to herself. There are days I forget what his voice sounded like. There are days I can still hear him breathing. Maybe that's the punishment, to carry both. She never mailed the letters. She kept them folded in a shoebox under her bed. Some nights, she'd take one out and read it aloud, her voice barely a whisper. And each time, it ended the same way. "I hope the quiet forgives me." On Cedar Knolls Drive, the house stood still. New owners had moved in, painted the walls pale yellow, replaced the carpet, filled the rooms with the sounds of a new family, children's laughter, the bark of a dog, the rhythm of normal life. But neighbors said the house still felt different. They said lights flickered, even when bulbs were new. They said the air inside was always a little too cold. One family moved out after a single year. The wife said she couldn't sleep there. She kept waking up around 3 a.m., convinced she heard whispering, not words, just the cadence of a woman's voice murmuring softly from the bedroom wall. When they left, she told the realtor, "It wasn't scary. It was sad." Bradley and Kaylee are adults now. They rarely speak publicly, but once, in a quiet interview, Kaylee said something that lingered. She said, "I don't remember the night. I just remember that my mom stopped smiling long before that." She paused, then added, "Some people think monsters are born. I think sometimes they're made, but she wasn't a monster. She was gone." Years later, in her small apartment, Susan kept to a strict routine. Dinner at 6, tea at 7, lights out by 10. She didn't have visitors. She didn't need them. On one particular night, humid, late summer, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. The power flickered. The room pulsed with flashes of distant lightning. She stood by the window, watching rain carve paths down the glass. Thunder rumbled, low and slow, the way a memory moves through the body. In the reflection, for just a moment, she saw two shapes, herself, and behind her, a man's outline. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. Instead, she whispered, "I know." The light flickered once more, then went dark. No one knows exactly where she is now. Some say she changed her name and moved north. Others say she remarried. The state records only mark her as released, completed sentence. But in Spring Branch, when the nights grow heavy with humidity, some neighbors still swear they can hear it. A faint tapping from the old Wright house, steady, patient, rhythmic, like a heart remembering what it once feared. 1, 2, 3. Then quiet, the kind of quiet that never really ends.